After years talking to astrophysicists, cosmologists, and scientists who've dedicated their entire lives to studying the universe, I started noticing a pattern. The more we understand the cosmos, the less likely it seems that we're alone. But that was never actually the most important question. The real question is what it would mean for us to discover that we aren't. I want to walk you through exactly how I arrived at that distinction, because it took me a long time and a lot of conversations with people who spend their careers staring into the deepest questions humans are capable of asking to understand why the second question matters so much more than the first. Most of the public conversation about extraterrestrial life gets stuck entirely on the first question, are we alone? Treated almost like a yes or no trivia answer waiting to be revealed. What I learned, sitting across from the people who actually study this properly, is that the scientific case for the first question has been quietly shifting for decades, and it's shifting toward probably not, with more confidence every year. But almost none of them think that's the interesting part anymore. The interesting part, the part that actually keeps them up at night, is what happens to us psychologically, culturally, spiritually, the moment that probably not becomes a confirmed no, we're not. Let me start with why the odds have shifted so much, because I think most people are working from a picture of this question that's decades out of date. For most of human history, the question of life elsewhere in the universe was almost entirely philosophical because we had no real data at all. We didn't know how common planets even were around other stars, let alone whether any of them could support life. That changed dramatically within the careers of scientists still working today. We now know, from direct observation, that planets are not rare. They are, if anything, the default outcome of star formation. Multiple astronomers described the same striking fact to me. Based on everything we've observed so far, it now looks like most stars in our galaxy host at least one planet, and a meaningful fraction of those planets sit within what's called the habitable zone, the range of distance from a star where conditions could allow liquid water to exist on a planet's surface, which is considered one of the most basic requirements for life as we understand it. When you take that fraction and multiply it across the actual number of stars in just our own galaxy, a number so large that most people have never really sat with the scale of it, you arrive at an estimate of potentially habitable planets that runs into the billions in the Milky Way alone. And the Milky Way is one galaxy among a number of other galaxies in the observable universe, so large that serious cosmologists genuinely struggle to communicate it in a way that feels emotionally real rather than just numerically abstract. I remember one astrophysicist trying to help me actually feel that number rather than just hear it, and the way she did it stuck with me. She said, imagine every grain of sand on every beach and in every desert on Earth. Now imagine that each one of those grains represents not a planet, but an entire galaxy, each containing hundreds of billions of stars of its own. That's closer to the actual scale of what we're talking about when we say the universe. And she said that even educated, scientifically literate people, herself included, still have to consciously fight the instinct to shrink that number down into something the human brain finds comfortable, because the honest scale of it is almost designed to be psychologically unmanageable. Given a scale like that, the scientific argument for probable life elsewhere isn't really a leap of faith anymore. It's closer to basic statistics. If even an extraordinarily small fraction of those billions of potentially habitable planets in just our own galaxy actually developed some form of life, the raw numbers suggest we should not be alone. Several scientists were careful to draw a distinction here that I think is worth being precise about too. There's a meaningful difference between simple life, microbial life, the kind that might exist in an ocean under the ice of a moon in our own solar system, and complex, intelligent life capable of technology and communication. The odds for the first kind, several astrobiologists told me, are looking increasingly favorable, to the point where some consider it plausible we could find direct evidence of simple life elsewhere within our own lifetimes, potentially even within our own solar system. The odds for the second kind, intelligent, technological life, remain far more uncertain because we genuinely don't know how many additional, harder evolutionary steps stand between simple life and something capable of building a radio telescope, and we only have exactly one data point ourselves to work from. That leads directly into something called the Fermi paradox, which came up in nearly every single conversation I had on this topic, and which I think is one of the most genuinely unsettling ideas in all of science once you actually sit with it properly. The paradox is simple to state and strange to actually absorb. If the universe is as vast and as old as we know it to be, and if life should statistically be common, then where is everybody? Given the age of the universe, even a civilization only slightly more advanced than our own, expanding at a very modest pace, should theoretically have had more than enough time to spread across an entire galaxy, and yet we see no unambiguous evidence of anyone else anywhere, despite looking. Several of the scientists I spoke with have their own favorite explanations for this silence, and I want to walk through the ones that came up most often, because each one carries a genuinely different emotional weight. And I think which explanation feels most plausible to you says something interesting about how you see the universe, and maybe about how you see us. The first explanation is that intelligent life truly is extraordinarily rare, rarer than the raw numbers suggest, because one or more of the specific evolutionary steps between simple life and technological intelligence turns out to be an almost impossibly unlikely filter, one we happen to get lucky enough to pass. This is sometimes called the Great Filter, and the unsettling version of this idea, the one a few scientists brought up with visible discomfort, is the possibility that the Great Filter isn't behind us in our evolutionary past, but ahead of us in our technological future, meaning civilizations reliably develop the intelligence to build advanced technology and then reliably fail to survive what that technology makes possible, whether through their own weapons, their own environmental damage, or their own runaway creations. If that version of the filter is correct, our current silence isn't necessarily good news. It might simply mean nobody has made it past exactly the stage we're at right now. The second explanation is more hopeful, and it's the one I noticed several scientists personally lean toward, even while being careful to present it as one possibility among several rather than a confident conclusion. It holds that advanced civilizations are out there, but expanding across a galaxy, or even reliably broadcasting detectable signals across interstellar distances for centuries at a time, may simply be far harder, slower, and rarer than early calculations assumed, and we may simply not have been looking in the right way, in the right place, for anywhere near long enough, given how young our own capacity to search has actually been measured against the age of the universe itself. The third explanation, and this is the one that produced the most interesting philosophical conversations, holds that advanced civilizations may deliberately choose not to announce themselves for reasons ranging from caution to a completely different set of priorities than expansion and broadcasting. Priorities we, as a young, resource-hungry, expansion-oriented species, might not intuitively understand or relate to at all. One cosmologist offered an analogy I found genuinely humbling. She said, "We assume any sufficiently advanced civilization would want to expand and communicate because those are the instincts a young, ambitious species has. But she said it's entirely possible that sufficient wisdom, expanding alongside sufficient capability, leads civilizations toward restraint rather than expansion. The same way an individual human being sometimes grows out of the loud, attention-seeking instincts of adolescence into something quieter and more deliberate. We may simply be too young, in cosmic terms, to understand what a truly mature civilization actually looks like or wants." I want to pause here and talk about the recent concrete developments that have actually moved this conversation from pure speculation towards something closer to active, ongoing science, because I think this is the part most people miss entirely. We are now able to study the atmospheres of planets orbiting other stars in real detail, identifying the specific chemical signatures present in that atmosphere from enormous distances away. Several scientists described the search for what are called biosignatures, combinations of gases in a planet's atmosphere that would be extremely difficult to explain through any process other than the presence of living organisms, as one of the most exciting active frontiers in all of science right now, precisely because for the very first time in human history, this isn't a purely theoretical question anymore. It's an observational one, with real instruments, pointed at real planets, actively gathering real data, right now, in a way that simply didn't exist even 20 years ago. More than one astronomer told me they genuinely believe there is a real, non-trivial chance that within their own working lifetime, we could detect a biosignature strong enough to shift the scientific consensus from life is probably common to something closer to we have direct evidence life exists beyond Earth. Not proof of intelligence, not a signal, but evidence of life itself, somewhere else, for the first time in recorded history. Now I want to turn to the part of all of this that I think actually matters most, the part that gave me the sentence I opened this video with. Every single scientist I spoke to, when I pushed past the technical details and asked what they actually think would happen to us, to human civilization, the day this kind of discovery was confirmed, gave me an answer that had far less to do with astrophysics and far more to do with psychology, philosophy, and in some cases, theology. Several historians of science pointed me toward the closest precedent we actually have, even though it's an imperfect one, the Copernican revolution, the moment humanity had to publicly accept that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but simply one planet orbiting an ordinary star among countless others. That shift, several historians pointed out, wasn't just a change in a scientific diagram. It was a genuine, centuries-long psychological and cultural upheaval because an enormous amount of human meaning, religious, philosophical, and personal, had been built on the assumption that this planet, and by extension the beings on it, occupied a uniquely central, uniquely important position in the cosmos. Confirming that we are not alone, several people I spoke with believe, would represent a psychological shift of a similar or even greater magnitude, a kind of second Copernican revolution, this time not about our planet's location in space, but about our species' uniqueness as a form of intelligence. I asked several scientists directly how they thought different parts of society would actually respond to a confirmed discovery, and I want to walk through the range of answers, because I think the honest picture is more layered than either the panic or the celebration you'd see in a movie about it. Several psychologists who study collective human reactions to major destabilizing news pointed out that the actual public response would likely depend enormously on what specifically was discovered. A confirmed biosignature on a distant planet, life, but simple, microbial, with no possibility of communication or contact, would almost certainly produce a wave of genuine wonder and excitement, dominating headlines for a period, and then several psychologists predicted settling relatively quickly into the background of ordinary life, in much the same way that most people today feel genuine but fairly brief excitement about extraordinary scientific discoveries before returning to their ordinary daily concerns. Human beings, it turns out, are remarkably good at absorbing even genuinely history-altering facts into the ordinary texture of daily life within a surprisingly short period of time. But several people I spoke with described a very different, far more destabilizing scenario if the discovery instead involved unambiguous evidence of intelligent, technological life, particularly if it came with the possibility, however remote, of eventual two-way contact. Here, the predicted reactions varied dramatically depending on who I was speaking with. Several scientists who study religion and belief systems pointed out that many major world religious traditions have actually engaged with this question in various forms for a very long time, and several theologians I spoke with from a range of different traditions described existing frameworks within their own faith that could genuinely accommodate the existence of other intelligent life without requiring a wholesale abandonment of their core beliefs. What several of them were more concerned about wasn't whether their theology could technically accommodate the discovery, but how ordinary believers, whose faith is often built more on emotional and community foundations than on abstract theological argument, would personally process a genuine, confirmed shift of this scale, especially if it happens suddenly rather than gradually. Several sociologists offered a different lens entirely, focusing less on belief systems and more on questions of identity and unity. A few pointed out something I found genuinely striking. Throughout human history, one of the most reliable ways to get deeply divided groups of people to set aside their differences, at least temporarily, has been the introduction of a common outside reference point, a shared frame that makes existing internal divisions look smaller by comparison. Some sociologists speculated that confirmed evidence of other intelligent life, even without any actual contact, could produce something like this effect at a planetary scale, for a period at least, as an enormous number of existing human divisions suddenly appear smaller against the backdrop of the entire species being recontextualized as one single shared us for the very first time in relation to a genuine external them. Other sociologists were far more skeptical of that hopeful reading, pointing out that human beings have an equally long, well-documented history of finding new reasons to divide against each other, even in the face of shared external circumstances, and that assuming a discovery like this would reliably unify us says more about our hope for unity than about any real historical pattern we should actually expect. I want to bring in one more thread here, because I think it's the one that affected me personally the most, and it has nothing to do with religion, politics, or sociology at all. It's about meaning at the level of an individual human life, and it came from a conversation with a cosmologist who has spent decades thinking about exactly this question. I asked her, fairly directly, whether she thought discovering we're not alone would make human life feel smaller, less significant, in the way some people instinctively fear, and she gave me an answer that completely reoriented how I think about the whole subject. She said the fear underneath that question assumes significance is a kind of fixed, limited resource that if something else out there also matters, it somehow means we matter less. The way a limited supply of anything gets diluted the more it's shared, but she said that's not actually how meaning works, at least not in her experience of it. She said discovering that consciousness, curiosity, and connection have arisen somewhere else in the universe wouldn't diminish the fact that they arose here too, in us, against odds, we're only now starting to properly appreciate. If anything, she said, it might be the single most powerful confirmation available that whatever process produces beings capable of asking these exact questions, wondering, reaching, searching for meaning and connection, is not a cosmic accident confined to one insignificant rock, but something closer to a genuine, recurring feature of a universe built, in some deep sense we don't yet fully understand, in a way that allows exactly this kind of thing to emerge, more than once. I've thought about that answer more than almost anything else anyone told me across all of these conversations, because I think it points to the actual resolution of the tension I opened this video with. The scientific question, are we alone, is fascinating, and the evidence increasingly suggests the honest answer is probably no. But the deeper question, what would it mean for us to know that for certain, isn't really a question about the universe at all. It's a question about us, about whether we're psychologically, spiritually, and culturally prepared to relocate ourselves within a much larger, much stranger story than the one most of human history was told inside of, and whether we can do that relocation without concluding, wrongly, that it makes our own particular chapter of that story any smaller or any less worth living fully. So let me try to turn this into something you can actually carry with you, because I don't want to leave you with just a fascinating idea and nowhere to put it. Here's what I've come to believe, after everything I've heard, about how to actually hold this question well, regardless of how or when it eventually gets answered. First, get comfortable with genuine uncertainty on the biggest questions, rather than needing a confident answer either way. The honest current scientific position isn't we know we're alone, and it isn't we know we're not. It's a genuinely open, actively evolving question, and I think there's something valuable in practicing the discipline of sitting with real uncertainty on a question this large, rather than reaching prematurely for whichever answer feels emotionally more comfortable to you. Second, notice your own instinctive reaction to the idea of not being alone, and get curious about where that reaction actually comes from. If the thought makes you feel smaller or afraid, ask yourself honestly why significance would need to be exclusive in order to feel real. If the thought excites you, ask yourself what specifically you're hoping it would mean. Connection, validation, a bigger story to be part of. Because I think examining that reaction honestly tells you something genuinely useful about your own relationship with meaning, independent of whatever the universe eventually turns out to contain. Third, let this question restore a sense of scale and proportion in your ordinary daily life, rather than treating it as a purely abstract, distant topic. Several scientists told me that regularly sitting with the genuine scale of the universe, its age, its size, the sheer number of stars and possible worlds, has a strange, reliably humbling effect on ordinary daily anxieties, disagreements, and self-importance, not because those things don't matter, but because holding both scales at once, the vastness of the cosmos and the specific, immediate texture of your own life, tends to put both in healthier proportion. Fourth, Stay genuinely curious about the actual science as it develops, rather than only engaging with this topic through science fiction or speculation. We are, right now, in one of the most active, fast-moving periods in the entire history of this question, with real instruments gathering real data about real planets. That's worth paying attention to as it unfolds, not just imagining as a distant hypothetical. And fifth, whatever you ultimately believe about what or who might be out there, let this question deepen your appreciation for what is unambiguously, certainly here, right now, a universe that managed to produce, at least once, beings capable of looking up, wondering, and asking exactly this question. Several scientists describe that fact alone, regardless of how the rest of the universe eventually turns out to answer it, as already one of the most remarkable things they've ever studied. I want to end with something one of the astrophysicists said to me, right at the very end of a long conversation, that I think captures everything I've tried to describe tonight better than I could on my own. She said that whether or not we ever find anyone else out there, the fact that we're capable of asking the question at all, capable of building telescopes powerful enough to study the atmosphere of a planet trillions of miles away, capable of sitting in a room together, wondering what it would mean to discover we're not alone, is itself one of the strangest, most improbable, most beautiful things the universe has ever produced, as far as we currently know. We spend so much of our lives asking whether we matter. She said, maybe the honest answer is that the universe already answered that question the moment it produced something capable of asking it in the first place, and everything else, whoever or whatever else might be out there, is simply the next chapter of a story that already, undeniably, began.